You don't need to be proven guilty of a crime for your goods to be taken away.
So there's no trial, there's no requirement to provide evidence to prove the state's suspicion. They just take your stuff.
Welcome to 5 to 4, where we dissect and analyze the Supreme Court decisions that have broken down American society like radiation on human DNA. We are talking about Bennis v. Michigan. This is a case about civil forfeiture, the process that allows cops to permanently seize the property of criminal suspects, whether or not they've been convicted of a crime. Before we get into it, I'm going to pose a law school-style hypothetical to our listeners.
Oh.
Yeah.
Hey.
Little blast from the past.
That's right. You are a married woman.
Okay.
You and your husband co-own a car that you share.
Mm-hmm.
One day, that no-good son of a bitch goes and hires a prostitute. And they do it in your car. They get
do
busted.
what?
Prostitute stuff.
Okay.
You know. Some cops bust them, right? And now the question is, who does the car belong to? If you answered the police department, you are correct. If not, you're going to want to keep listening.
Stupid.
This case is from 1996, and it goes 5 to 4 along mostly ideological lines with one exception. Kennedy joins the dissenters, while a young and spry, notorious RBG joins the conservatives. Yet another example of just how weak and out of touch Ginsburg often is on issues concerning police abuses.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ruth.
It was a different time, though. Mid-90s. Fresh Prince still on the air.
And that caused Ruth to be a dumbass, I guess.
The one
That's
and
my
only
guiding
cultural
light.
test. Peter's lodestar. It's the run of Fresh Prince.
The majority is written by Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who we've noted in the past is an all-time piece of shit.
Absolutely.
We'll talk a little bit about his judicial philosophy, because it's not just important to this case, but also to how a lot of conservatives perceive the Constitution. Conservatives, and especially the ostensibly serious conservative intellectuals, will often talk about how they favor small government. And as many people have observed, any digging will reveal that what they mean is a small federal government, and that they are often surprisingly supportive of leaving people at the violent whims of state and local governments. So
yeah. Without getting too technical, there's this idea from English common law that property used or money earned as part of criminal activity is also said to be like guilty, so to speak.
Right.
Like the property, right? The thing.
Yeah.
Separate and apart from the person who's accused of criminal activity. And our law allows for what's called an in rem proceeding, meaning a lawsuit against an item rather than a person.
Oof.
In a criminal case, like the case name, right? We're all familiar with that. It'll be like State of Texas versus Don Johnson, name of the person. But like the accompanying civil forfeiture case, that case is called like State of Texas versus 2014 Hyundai Elantra. It is a civil proceeding against a piece of property.
Hyundai, how do you plead?
An owner of the property can contest the lawsuit or assert her own defenses to the property being seized, but that doesn't happen often. So it'll be like State of Texas versus 2009 Chevy Silverado, State of Texas versus $1,785, State of Texas versus Sea-Doo jet ski, over and over and over, like dozens of cases. And the judge says, is anybody here to contest this? Silence in the courtroom, and the judge goes, granted, to every single one, and then moves on.
That is my Sea-Doo, Your Honor, and it did nothing wrong.
Okay, Tina and John Bennis are a married couple living in Detroit, Michigan in 1988.
But it gets worse.
When one night, John doesn't come home at the usual time after work. Now, Tina, a concerned wife, she's frantic. She starts making phone calls. And the next morning, finally, she gets a hold of a donut addict at the Detroit police station. And she learns that, what do you know? Dear husband John is in jail because he was arrested last night for soliciting a sex worker. And as if this isn't bad enough for Tina's life, her Rolling Stone was caught engaged in illegal sexual activity inside the car that John and Tina owned together. It's a 1977 Pontiac. So John and Tina, in fact, had split the $600 cost and purchased that car together. And now Tina's cheating ass husband is in jail and she doesn't have a car because the county seized it when John was arrested, saying that it was part of his criminal activity in soliciting a sex worker. So the county moved to forfeit ownership of the car from the Bennises to them under the Michigan-specific statutes at that time. And remember earlier I said that in these civil forfeiture cases, often the legal basis for forfeiture is this legal fiction that a piece of property is somehow guilty. So here, in the Michigan case, the county filed a lawsuit that gets the Bennis' Pontiac declared a public nuisance, and then their ownership interest, the Bennis' ownership interest in the property, is forfeited to the county.
To be fair, it does sound ridiculous that the Pontiac could itself be guilty, but if any car was going to solicit sex, I feel like a 77 Pontiac sounds about right.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Tina says, wait a minute, like my raggedy piece of shit husband aside, that's my car too. I paid for it. It's my private property. And I didn't know my soon-to-be ex-husband was going to go around getting illegal blowies in it, you know?
Yeah.
Tina wants to assert what's called an innocent owner defense, which is to say, I own this piece of property that was seized, but I was innocent of any criminal activity, and so I should retain my ownership in that property. But Michigan law didn't allow for an innocent owner defense to civil forfeiture. So the trial judge in Wayne County basically said, so what, Tina, and ordered that the car be confiscated.
Yeah.
And he noted that he could order that Tina Bennis be compensated for the $300 that she put into the car to purchase it. But he notes, I'm not going to do that. And his legal reasoning is basically that the car is an old piece of shit. He says, quote, there's practically nothing left minus costs in a situation such as this. And I feel okay, fine, Mr. Shady Shade, insult their car or whatever. But why then is it so important for the county to seize ownership if it's a valueless car?
Right.
You know, Tina, this woman whose life is just an absolute shambles. Is essentially saying that when you confiscate my car for something my husband did when I didn't know about it, that is fundamentally unfair to me and should be considered a violation of my due process rights. And also, I was not compensated for it.
Right.
And the court's actually, no, we think that that's okay. Whatever.
It's good. It's right. Yeah.
So this opinion, no joke, opens up by talking about a case from 1827. Where a ship that had been commissioned by the King of Spain attacked a U.S. vessel and was therefore held to be forfeited, even though the owner himself was not responsible for the attack. The court there held that the offense was attached primarily to the ship, so the ship itself could be seized. This is sort of getting back at what Rhiannon was talking about, where the ship is guilty.
Right, yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So on top of the fact that this makes no sense, because the ship itself is not responsible for an attack, who gives a shit about this?
Right.
As a rule, if you find yourself investigating a situation involving the King of Spain in 1827, so you can figure out what to do about a guy who paid $6 for a blowjob in a Pontiac in 1993, maybe you should take a step back and ask yourself what the fuck you're doing. And so Rehnquist just keeps going on. He then cites to an 1878 case about a person who was leasing a distillery, a 1926 case about a car dealership. I assume that was the first car dealership. And finally, the most recent... That was not that good, Rhea.
No, it's just thinking about the first car dealership ever. It's really funny.
Some guy was like, what if I sold these cars?
Right.
What if I had a bunch of them?
They're transitioning. So they also sell horses and horse-drawn carriages.
Right.
And they're look, we got this new technology shit.
You want a car or a unicycle? The premise is that the property being seized is somehow attached to the criminal offense that it was used to commit, as if the property itself is guilty. But that doesn't really make any sense, obviously. The fact that an inanimate object was used to commit a crime does not mean that the crime and the object are somehow meaningfully intertwined with one another.
Right.
One of conservatives' favorite sayings is, guns don't kill people, people kill people.
Right.
You know, in my mind, maybe a bit of an oversimplification, but a much more convincing slogan is, cars don't hire prostitutes. People hire prostitutes. The car is not related to the crime. It's not even really making the crime easier, or at least drastically easier.
Yeah.
So what good reason is there to deprive a rightful owner of her right to the car? Because it was used by someone who happened to be hiring a prostitute at the time.
Right. Yeah.
And if there's no good reason, besides the fact that we've always done it, how can it not be a violation of our constitutional right to due process? I think that's like the bottom line for me.
Yeah.
One of the dissents here is by Justice John Paul Stevens. The dissent itself hits all the major points, I think, and maybe the funnest part of it is when he says that using this logic, the government could seize a cruise ship because one passenger committed a crime. And I swear to God, Rehnquist's only response to this is literally, well, we've never held that the government could seize a cruise ship because one passenger committed a crime.
Thanks,
That's
Bill.
it.
Yeah.
Stevens is saying, look, this rule cannot be right because it would lead to like these insane outcomes. And Rehnquist goes, yeah, but this case isn't about cruise ships, buddy, so whatever.
That's something else.
It's so fucking dumb.
It's so fucking dumb. Just no regard for whether or not the reasoning he's using is sound. And also sort of implying like, yeah, well, if that happens, we'll just make up a rule that says you can't do it. Bada bing, bada boom.
Right.
You lose, Stevens. The next thing he does is dive into some of the reasons that the rule exists, and they're all just dog shit stupid. He says, look, this isn't meant to punish the owners. It has a deterrent purpose. It prevents the illegal use of property by, quote, rendering illegal activity unprofitable. This is the kind of reasoning that should get you disbarred, I think. Like, anyone who understands the meaning of words can tell you that, like, you can't deter crimes by punishing people who don't have anything to do with the crime.
Right,
This woman
right.
was sitting at home. She can't be deterred from doing anything.
Exactly.
It's bizarre.
In light of this ruling, wives aren't going to stop like co-owning cars with their husbands.
Exactly.
I'll teach you to
Like-
trust that piece of shit you married, Tina.
Right.
Like, the whole point is that they don't
So
know that the
fucking
property is
stupid.
being used for illegal activity. It's the whole point.
Exactly.
To give him a little bit of credit, I think what he's getting at is to say, like, look, you'll be more careful with who you let use your property if you know the government can seize it if a crime happens.
Yeah.
Not only is that extremely tenuous, it's not addressing the situation here, which is just punishing an innocent party, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's especially bizarre in the context of a marriage, but it's really bizarre in almost any context where you just sort of loan out your property to someone who has like a good reason to use it.
Yeah.
Right. And Rehnquist doesn't talk about another reason for civil forfeiture to exist. And it's because a big reason for its existence actually cuts against everything he wants to do here.
Oh.
Yeah, interestingly enough, as Peter mentioned, it starts like with admiralty, maritime cases, and all the early cases are like on the ocean, boats, or like customs, import,
Right.
export
Yeah.
stuff. What those have in common is that often the actual guilty party isn't in the personal jurisdiction of the United States courts.
Right.
So you can't go arrest the King of Spain or whatever. All you have is the shit, right?
Exactly.
You have their contraband, you have their boat. And so you're like, well, we can't, drag him into court, but we can take his shit.
Right.
But you can bring John Bennis into court here.
Right.
There's no level of applicability to that sort of animating principle for this at all in the modern uses of civil forfeiture.
That's a
Right.
really good point.
Right. So I want to talk about the dissents and the concurrences a little bit here. As we mentioned, Stevens's dissent, very solid.
Yeah.
Starts with a great opening line, quote, "For centuries, prostitutes have been plying their trade on other people's property."
Okay, Stevens.
Yeah,
All right.
buddy.
All right,
Yeah,
Johnny.
buddy.
Speak on it, dude.
To put this in perspective, Stevens was like 80 years old.
And still, Stevens said sex worker rights now.
That's right.
But he was like a Navy man, right? In his younger days.
That's
So
right.
He
Yes.
probably docked his ship in many foreign ports of call.
That's right. So, the rest of his dissent makes a very compelling case in my mind that it should be unconstitutional to seize property that is only incidentally used in criminal activity.
Yeah.
And he has a really good example of this. He talks about like real property, like an apartment building. And he's like, look, nobody contests that you can't seize an apartment building from its owner because one tenant was like smoking a joint in his unit. And Stephen's point is like, look, the car is being used in the same way. It's just a place to do it, right? It's not like when you're bootlegging or pirateering or whatever. And he notes that like this point was actually addressed in the Michigan courts. And the way they get around it is by saying, well, look, as I think Rhiannon said up top, this car is a nuisance. And the reason it's a nuisance is because it was being used in an area that is itself an ongoing nuisance. This area is so blighted that like everything in it's a nuisance, and especially if you're like getting a blowjob in it, your car is a nuisance. And this kind of highlights like the inherent inequality built into this. Some rich asshole in like a nice neighborhood could get a blowjob in his car.
Right.
And that wouldn't be a public nuisance because it's a nice neighborhood.
Exactly.
And so his fucking Mercedes can't be taken by the state.
Yeah. The prostitute's cuter. The judge is like, this whole thing looks good to me.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just total bullshit. And it kind of shows just how unfair and unjust this is.
Right. Justice Kennedy, just a quick aside to give him some credit here. He files a very short dissent. We have noted in the past that we consider him a pretty dumb guy.
Yeah.
All of his best decisions are sort of the result of his libertarian streak, and this is one of them. And it comes up in gay marriage cases too. Here and there, he will pop up with these sort of libertarian takes and say, I don't think the government should be able to do this.
Yeah.
And, pat on the back. Ginsburg files a concurrence. As we mentioned, it's just her at her worst.
Yeah. Just awful.
I think the reason she files a concurrence is to sort of try to explain herself here. And she basically tries to rely on the technicalities and procedures of the specific case and the specific Michigan law to justify the court's approach. She goes so far to point out that they had another car.
Tina and John Bennis did.
Yeah. As if your constitutional right to not have your car seized for no good reason disappears when you have like two cars or whatever. She focuses on these minor technical points about the case rather than addressing the broader issue of what the state can do constitutionally to someone who has not done a single thing wrong.
Yeah.
There are two little technicalities in particular that she hangs her hat on, which is one, that the court had discretion to like give Tina Bennis money back. Reminder of how it used that discretion is to not give her anything and insult her.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The other thing she hangs her hat on is that this is all when a court is sitting in equity. That's how these are decided. Rather than a court of law, a court of equity sort of considerations of fairness predominate more so than strict legal rules, which is why like court has discretion to maybe give her money and things like that. It's like, what's fair?
This is something that like only lawyers know, the whole like equity concept, but like there's an entirely different part of the law that is like the equitable part of law where courts are just like, they're sort of measuring what is fair. And it's considered like a separate and unique part of the law from how courts usually analyze cases.
Right.
Where fairness just doesn't matter.
We're saying like fairness is a different part of the law than just regular law. Right.
At best, a secondary concern in the normal course of business. Right.
Like the fact that the court is allowed to consider fairness is separate and apart from whether they were actually fair to her. So, like, I don't see how this gets around the fundamental problem here.
Exactly.
Yeah, her punctuation is saying, like, look, we wouldn't be showing respect to Michigan if we don't think they would be good at equitably administering these sorts of actions. And it's like, this very case, the equities, the discretion were, like, abused. And, all they did was humiliate this woman.
Exactly.
Like,
it's fundamentally unfair. One case from 2014, I think, like highlights how egregious these practices often are. A guy named Chris Suravelis, his son was arrested outside the family home for selling like $40 worth of drugs. And when his son was arrested, police kicked out Chris and his wife from the house and took it over. Chris and the Suravelis family had to appear in court 9 times to get their house back, and they could only get their house back once they agreed to change the locks and never let their son stay there.
It's illegal to have a cool son, I guess.
prosecutors will dip into civil asset forfeiture funds to take vacations, to pay their secretary, to, give everybody a nice holiday bonus.
Functionally indistinguishable from like the mob.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Just a protection
Stealing
racket.
money and then like using it for their lifestyle, right? Like, and like taking care
Backed
of their own.
by the threat of violence.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If you're a listener to our show, there's a decent chance you are a law student or lawyer, decent chance you come from a fairly well-off community. How many kids you knew dealing weed in high school,
Right.
in college? How many kids did you know that bought and, in some way distributed cocaine in college or after college?
Or Adderall.
And can you DM me their contact?
Did it feel to you, does it feel now like there was ever any significant risk that their parents' house would be taken away?
Exactly. It's
Of
fucking
course
absurd.
not. This is something that happens to poor people. That's it.
Yeah.
This is a system by which the government and police in particular literally siphon money out of poor communities.
Yes.
And they do it using the same justification that has been used throughout history in 1,000 different contexts by claiming that it's necessary in some way to maintain the peace. That's why it's necessary for a cohesive interpretation of the Constitution to account for context, to account for power and powerlessness. Without that perspective, when you view the law as nothing more than like a series of rules, you get the court receiving a case about a woman whose car was seized by police and somehow discussing what the King of Spain was up to
Right.
in 1827.
Yeah.
It's inherently absurd, and it is an output of a philosophy of law that has completely decontextualized the practice and understanding of law from the people that it impacts.